Hello and welcome. My name is Susan Gunn. I'm the director of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. My colleague, Chloe Noel, and I are coming to you from our homes in Washington, D.C. And even while we're working from home during this pandemic, we from the Office for Global Concerns continue to represent the three branches of the Maryknoll mission. That's the Maryknoll Sisters, the Fathers and Brothers, and the lay missioners. And we also work closely with the Maryknoll affiliates. And our job is to bring the Maryknoll mission experience to important debates about public policy at the UN, on Capitol Hill, to the World Bank, the IMF, and the corporate world. Our mission is to promote peace, social justice, and the integrity of creation. And we do this through education, advocacy, and action. And today we want to offer some education, and this time about US trade policy. I'm so excited to welcome Chloe and have her present today because she's the leading thinker on US trade policy for Maryknoll. For more than 6 years now, Chloe has served as coordinator of our Faith-Economy-Ecology Program. And this makes her the right person to strengthen the voice of the US Catholic community to address the intersection of our faith and the environment and our trade policies. So while Chloe talks to us about trade, I want to invite you all to type questions for her in the Zoom Q&A, or if you're on YouTube, in the chat box. And with that, I turn it over to you, Chloe.
Hi, great. So wonderful to be with all of you today. I'm going to share with you a presentation, and afterwards we will follow up with some questions. So without further ado, let's see. On behalf of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns, thank you and welcome to today's Faithful Voting and Global Concerns webinar, U.S. Trade Policy, Putting People and Planet First. This is the 6th webinar in our election series that seeks to shine a light on the international issues important to consider ahead of the U.S. November elections. The issues we chose for the series touch the lives of people and communities around the world that Maryknoll missioners accompany. These issues also affect us here at home. Today we are discussing U.S. trade policy and its impacts on people and planet. Each of our webinar topics is based on a 2-page brief. While not exhaustive, it is meant to give you the facts, offer some analysis, and point you in the right direction for taking action, including voting in November. On our website, www.maryknollogc.org, you will find right at the top the link to the series of election briefs. Before you scroll down to find the 8 topics, you'll see a description of the method we used for the series, the See, Judge, Act method. Let's jump into today's webinar topic on U.S. trade policy, starting with C. Let's look at the facts and try to understand the signs of the times. Today's modern-day international trading system is dominated by corporate interests and the world's wealthiest and most powerful countries. This is especially true for agreements between the United States and developing countries, which inherently put developing countries in a weaker negotiating position. Manufacturing. Regional trade tripled under the agreement, but the gains have not trickled down to everyone, especially the most vulnerable. NAFTA and other trade deals have contributed to the outsourcing of pollution and manufacturing jobs from the United States, affecting families in cities like Pittsburgh, Detroit, and El Paso. NAFTA contributed to manufacturing wage stagnation and lost family farming livelihoods in Mexico, and also to migration to the United States. NAFTA expanded the power of corporations. It was the 20th century trade template. This year, in July 2020, after long negotiations, a new version of NAFTA went into effect. It's called the Usmca, or the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It was touted by both House Democrats and the White House as a 21st century trade template. While it makes some modest improvements, the USMCA does not represent the transformational trade policy needed to care for local economies, communities, and God's creation. Free trade policies are often intended to reduce barriers for trade, such as eliminating tariffs. While these actions can have a positive impact on opening up markets for new products and offering countries the opportunity to export domestic goods, it also has some negative consequences. It takes away a tool, especially for developing countries, to shield their economy and protect wages and jobs from cheaper imports from trading partners and corporations. For instance, in the case of NAFTA, 2 million smallholder farmers in Mexico, many of whom are indigenous, lost their livelihoods when the United States began exporting cheaper corn to Mexico in the 1990s. Due in part to the elimination of tariffs and continued subsidies for farmers in the United States, Mexico was unable to protect its small farmers. While the U.S. has strong-armed other countries to cancel subsidies during trade negotiations, the U.S. has managed to protect its own subsidies on cash crops such as corn. Trade agreements are not just about limiting tariffs, they also change domestic policies that affect everyday lives, such as access to life-saving medicines, financial controls used to weather economic crises, food access, and farming practices. These priorities are superseded by the overriding objective of creating a corporate-friendly regulatory environment for foreign direct investment. Some of these policy changes are reinforced by a legal tool called investor-state dispute settlement. The ISDS sets up a non-transparent court system that is not accountable to domestic courts or policies. This system challenges the notion of national sovereignty and the ability of countries to make their own domestic policies. ISDS allows corporations to sue governments when they think that they have been treated unfairly, such as giving preference to a domestic producer over a foreign company, or for passing a law that would regulate their industry. NAFTA was the first trade agreement to include ISDS. Again, the objective is to create a corporate-friendly regulatory environment. These lawsuits are decided by a panel of 3 judges of corporate lawyers, most of whom are adjudicating other ISDS cases in non-transparent courtrooms out of the public eye and housed in the World Bank. Folks, I can't make this up. The decisions can cost countries millions or billions of dollars and have a regulatory chilling effect, discouraging countries from regulating industries subject to these special trade privileges. The decisions are final. Even the threat of an ISDS suit can be enough to stifle attempts to implement policies or develop regulations that would serve the common good. Here are a few examples of these lawsuits. The countries that acted in favor of public health or in response to social conflict, such as the Bear Creek case, a case that Maryknoll supported partner Association for Human Rights and the Environment supported. ISDS essentially overrides any buy local policies in any country or locality that has adopted this mechanism. For instance, a U.S. Depression-era law gives government purchasing preferences for products made in America. The idea was that American tax dollars would go back to the communities or companies producing the product. In order to accommodate these investor privileges in trade and investment agreements that limit the ability of countries to protect their own domestic industries, presidents have consistently given waivers to trading partners. At any point, a president can use their pen to take these waivers away. Buy American now means products and contract bids from any country with which the U.S. has a trading relationship. This includes 60 countries. This sells out American workers and communities. Biden's trade plan says that he plans to work with allies to update international trade rules for Buy American to ensure that the U.S. and other countries can use their own domestic tax dollars to spur investment in their countries. Trump has repeatedly stated that he wants to bring back jobs for American workers, and he can make the changes now. There is a global effort by countries to terminate or renegotiate these kinds of investment treaties and provisions. Dropping ISDS has not harmed their economies. One positive amendment to the Usmca that the Trump administration included removed the ISDS provision for every industry but the oil and gas industries. While this is an important step, it is incomplete in that the fossil fuel industry is still able to take advantage of these investor privileges when we are facing the global existential threat of climate change. While protections for corporations are strong, protections for workers, the environment, and everyone else remain weak in trade deals. U.S. trade deals include labor and environmental enforcement mechanisms, but early deals like NAFTA are particularly weak. Unlike ISDS, the arbitration decisions are non-binding, and the enforcement system has proven to be ineffective. It can take years for a case to be decided, and the decision doesn't actually address the problem. Amidst a rise in anti-union violence, in 2008, the AFL-CIO and 6 Guatemala trade unions filed a complaint that the U.S. took to the CAFTA arbitration panel, alleging that Guatemala was failing to effectively enforce its labor laws. The arbitration panel ruled in 2017 that Guatemala did not violate their labor obligations in a manner affecting trade. This decision demonstrates that under this system, the labor provisions are ineffective in protecting labor rights unless it stands in the way of free trade. While some improvements were made in the USMCA, they could be stronger. The environmental reforms are based on 2007 reform efforts and do not reflect the current policies of today or what we will need in the future as we face the climate emergency. As part of the USMCA negotiations, the U.S. insisted that Mexico pass labor reforms to protect Mexican workers. Just weeks before the USMCA went into force, Mexican labor lawyer Susannah Prieto was arrested in Matamoros, Mexico, on bogus charges of inciting violence for her work supporting workers at a U.S.-owned factory trying to unionize and protect themselves from COVID-19. She was released on July 1st, the day that the USMCA went into force. The response to Susannah's arrest and attacks on other workers is a barometer for whether the USMCA labor reforms will mean anything at all. The same might be said for the environmental provisions. The whole trade process is pretty non-transparent and becoming more so all the time, with nearly 500 corporate trade advisors and less than 70 civil society representatives with access to draft texts that not even members of Congress are able to see. It's no wonder that corporations reap the greatest benefits from the deals. Additionally, since 2017, there have been no public stakeholder presence at the official negotiations to share alternative views on trade and advocate for better trade policies. Another aspect of trade policy that has been in the news is the growing use of U.S. trade policy, and tariffs in particular, as a weapon to sanction other countries. Under the Trump administration, the United States has indiscriminately used the threat or use of tariffs on steel, solar panels, and agriculture as a negotiating tactic with China, the EU, Mexico, and Canada. But they've also led to tariffs on American products and trade wars. These tariffs have hurt U.S. farmers and manufacturers and international relationships. While past administrations have used trade as a soft diplomacy tool, the Trump administration has used it as a hard diplomacy tool, although it is not always clear to what end. The coronavirus has demonstrated the weaknesses of a globalized economy. With the economic shutdowns and shelter-in-place orders, global supply chains have been disrupted, affecting access to food, medicines, PPE, and consumer goods. More than ever, we see the value of a diversified supply chain and the need to support local industries. This is affirmed by the witness of Maryknoll Missioners and the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs that said, amidst slowing global trade, a recalibration towards more regional trade may be the best way forward for many developing countries. One trade issue we are watching now is the trade negotiations between the U.S. and Kenya. This would be the first FTA of its kind with the United States on the African continent. We are concerned about the deal due to the extreme economic imbalance between the countries and the regional trading relationships that already exist between countries in East Africa. Now on to the judge section, where we analyze the issue according to the teachings of our faith. The faith values of dignity, sufficiency, subsidiarity, participation, and stewardship of God's creation, and justice are all at the heart of a fair trade policy. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops lists 10 principles for a framework for economic life, the first being that the economy exists for the person, not the person for the economy. Nearly 10 years before NAFTA, the U.S. bishops adopted the pastoral letter Economic Justice for All, in which they say, our faith calls us to measure this economy not only by what it produces, but also how it touches human life and whether it protects or undermines the dignity of the human person. With the publication of Laudato Si in 2015, Pope Francis extended this measure to include the whole of God's creation. The bishops continue to advocate for people-centered trade policies, regularly sending letters to Congress and the President to promote a just and sustainable trade policy in service of the common good. You can find all those materials on their website, and we will link to it on our resource page. Maryknoll leadership has also expressed its perspective on trade policy in light of missioners' experiences, starting with the statement Trading in Justice, released in 2002. Our office, the Office for Global Concerns, has offered analysis, action alerts, and education materials on trade and trade alternatives, in addition to actively advocating for human and environmentally centered trade policies. We are founding members of the Interfaith Working Group on Trade and Investment, which developed principles for responsible trade nearly 2 decades ago that remain relevant today. You can find the principles and other trade materials on our resources page. Contrary to common political arguments around trade that pits U.S. workers against foreign workers or labor interests against environmental interests, the lived experience of Maryknoll missioners gives us the perspective that the workers and God's creation everywhere are harmed by these trade agreements. We are in this together to work for the common good of all and not to put one group of people or one country first. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, raises concern about state sovereignty in relation to international trade policies. Pope Francis goes further, speaking of economic policies as new forms of colonialism. That brings us to the final step in our method, the ACT section, where we learn to take action as Christians, as Catholics, as global citizens. Take advantage of virtual candidate forums or contact your candidates via social media and other means to encourage them to go beyond the reforms in the USMCA and to develop transformational trade policy that serves the common good. Also, explore your candidate's website to learn more about his or her platforms. Throughout the pandemic, I have enjoyed listening to the podcast Rethink Trade with Public Citizens Global Trade Watch Director Lori Wallach. She offers a fresh and brief analysis on current trade and globalization issues. Check it out. And lastly, vote. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Wow, you are inspiring, but you absolutely raised some compelling points about church teaching and how far we are from a just and sustainable trade policy right now, and particularly in light of the coronavirus pandemic. So I have 3 questions, and the first one is we're really getting questions about this investor state dispute settlement court, the ISDS court mechanism that you mentioned, where corporations can sue countries over any laws or regulations that they think is inhibiting their ability to make a profit or future profits, I believe you said. So the first time I heard about the ISDS, I was really shocked. So I just want to invite you to say more about it and give some examples of the impact.
Yeah, just to speak to the ways that corporations are using this tool to avoid regulations and walk away from their responsibilities to people and the environment. I'll just mention briefly a few different cases that I showed pictures of before. In the case of Philip Morris versus Uruguay, they had passed a plain packaging rule that would discourage people from smoking, and it was a way of fulfilling their commitment to the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And then Philip Morris sued them, saying that they were expropriating their property by covering 80% of the packaging with smoking warnings, leaving little space for their brand. And they sued Uruguay over this for $25 million. And in the end, they lost the case. And when you combine all the legal fees that went to this on both sides and the payout that Philip Morris had to actually give back to Uruguay for their legal fees, they spent $28 million. So that's more than the original amount that Philip Morris had sued for, and really just shows that this is just a way to try to ice regulations of smoking. And there's a lot of other countries that were waiting to see what the decision was going to be on the Uruguay case, and a similar one in Australia. And, it worked for a little while, and that those countries were not able to implement those anti-smoking policies that they really wanted to protect their people. And maybe just very quickly, this one last case I'll highlight is that Bear Creek case, where the Bear Creek Mining Company sued Peru. And this was the case that one of our Maryknoll partners was involved in. And there were large protests against this mine, and people walked from the border of Bolivia all the way up to Puno, Peru, a southern city in Peru, and protested for about 5 weeks until there came a point in which there was police violence against some of the protesters, and people were quite upset that they hadn't even been consulted about the project, and knowing that it was going to impact their sacred sites and their water sources. They were, of course, righteously angry about that. And in the end, Peru kind of won that case. They did have to pay out a little bit to cover sort of the legal fees and the original limited investment that Bear Creek had made. But it was just a fraction of the $522 million that they'd sued for, which was to cover the profits of that mine and another mine that they were just starting based on the profits of the first mine. So it's pretty incredible.
Right, corporate power and big money on the line. Yeah. Okay, another question. You shared another compelling story, this time about the arrest of the Mexican labor activist, Susannah Prieto, right when the USMCA trade deal went into effect. Could you tell us more about her situation?
Yeah, she was released from prison on July 1st. One of the arguments she made as to why she should be released is she was quite concerned for her own health and the possibility of getting COVID-19. And, you know, after lots of pressure, she was able to be released, but on pretty bad terms. She can no longer travel to Tamaulipas, where she was working with the workers up on the border, and has to stay in Chihuahua for the next 2.5 years, sort of like a house arrest of sorts. And a warrant for her arrest was announced in Chihuahua, but to my knowledge, she still remains free at this time. And it's really disappointing that the president of Mexico, Lopez Obrador, who came in as a labor president, has not really come to her defense. And this is concerning in that, you know, this is the moment where we need to get these labor provisions right. And if we can't enforce them right now when it's just coming into effect and under this pro-labor president, then will they ever be reinforced? So it's a deeply concerning case right now.
These are all really serious concerns, but I'm going to try to shift gears and ask you, can you give us some hope? Can you name one thing right now that's giving you hope about trade policy? You know, we're in the middle of this economic crisis and public health crisis. Where do you see some hope?
Well, I think that the coronavirus, as awful as it's been, actually gives us a little bit of opportunity for hope, because we've all had time to reflect on our economy and understanding how intertwined our global economy is and the impacts that it's having, you know, down at a very, very local level and yet in a big picture throughout the entire supply chain. So we have an opportunity now to reinvest in local economies so that when there's another economic disaster or pandemic like we're facing now, that we aren't reliant on like one or two countries to provide us the goods we need, but that we can be more reliant on our local communities and really support those communities economically. So I think that's a big opportunity that we have right now, is to reinvest at the local level. And, you know, Pope Francis has been hosting these Wednesday audiences to talk about COVID-19 and how we can respond to the pandemic and apply Catholic social teaching to respond to the crisis. So I'd encourage you to tune in. There's been a lot of work being done by people in the Catholic community to try to think about a just response to the COVID-19 crisis, both economic and health and environment. So there's a lot there that can give us hope within the church itself.
Yeah. Oh, that's great, Chloe. Thank you. I'm looking at the time, and I think that's all we have time for today. And I want to say a big thank you to Chloe for this excellent presentation about a complex and yet so important topic. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope this webinar and the 2-page brief about trade policy that's available on our website encourages all of us to contribute to these important conversations before the November election. And I want to invite you to our next webinar, which is September 17th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And Dan Moriarty will present Rethinking National Security in the Pandemic. And the registration for that is on our website. So just follow Chloe's directions to go to www.maryknollogc.org, and you can't miss it. So I hope to see you all September 17th. And until then, peace, be well. Goodbye.